Hi, welcome to another episode of Author Spotlight. This is the program on AADL TV where I like to look at the works of one author. My name is Lucy, and for this episode, I am going to shine my spotlight on the writer Quan Barry. Quan Barry is a poet, a playwright, and a novelist. She was born in Saigon and raised in Massachusetts by an adoptive family. She is the Lorraine Hansberry Professor of English at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And she is the author of 6 books, 3 of which are novels. She's also written 2 collections of poetry and a play. The novels are what I'm going to talk about today, and you will see why. If you're not familiar with Quan Barry's books, each one of these novels is a world unto itself, and they're all so vastly different. She just transports you through her writing. The first novel that Quan Barry published is called She Weeps Each Time You're Born, and this came out in 2014. In an NPR interview, Quan Barry said, "This book is very much about a character who can hear the voices of the dead, and I was interested in trying to transform Vietnam from the perceptions that we have about it in the West." This is a book that takes place in Vietnam, starting in the 1940s, in the days of French Indochina, and goes through the 1970s to the days of reunification. And the whole story is told, or actually really felt, by a character named Rabbit. This is the character that hears the dead. Rabbit is born in 1972 as an orphan, and she's found on her dead mother's body. She is then thrown into this unusual family, including a woman who feeds her, a woman named Kui, who has no children of her own. She experienced a horrific abortion, but she has since then continuously produced milk. And so she is able to feed Rabbit and sustains Rabbit for years. Kui does not speak at all, but she's a sort of magical character. She has this ability to produce milk. She's known for her pale, ghostly skin and hair, and so she just has this mythical quality about her. Rabbit is named, and I will quote from the book, "After the rabbit with its innocence, its youthfulness, its long bright ears that hear everything in the realms of both the living and the dead. Rabbit, because the world is full of rabbits. Rabbit, because by sheer force of numbers, the rabbit walks among us unnoticed, but pandemic." So the amount of history that is packed into this book is incredible. I learned so much from reading this book that I never knew about the history of Vietnam. It's expansive, and it's an interesting way to look at the history of Vietnam because we are getting it. It's relayed to us in part through these corpses, the voices that Rabbit hears wherever she goes. So it's heartbreaking and it's challenging because there's this pile of bodies that we hear from. And so we're getting a narrative that is taking place in the time that Rabbit is existing and is traveling throughout Vietnam. But we also have these side stories where we learn more about the characters who are traveling with Rabbit. Like her grandmother, we learned about her grandmother's time in the 1920s, living essentially as a slave on a rubber plantation. And that's just one of the interesting parts about Vietnam's history that I learned. As I said before, there's so much packed into this book. It's also beautifully written. And though it seems like a strange way to have a narrative delivered to you through these voices of the dead, as heard by this one character, it's not. It's actually really kind of brilliant because Quan Barry has allowed us to hear from not only living voices, but dead voices as well. And they have a lot of history to impart. And it's amazing how absolutely different She Weeps Each Time You're Born is from Quan Barry's second novel, which is called We Ride Upon Sticks, and this came out in 2020. A quote from this book says, "Every 300 years or so, our kind gets loosed upon an unsuspecting world, and this time around, the history books would know us as the 1989 Danvers High School women's varsity field hockey team." So this book is a witchcraft / field hockey / high school drama novel that takes place in 1989 in Danvers, Massachusetts. And the story is about the Danvers Falcons, who are a field hockey team. The Danvers Falcons are doing horribly. They're having a very bad season until they each take a pledge in a notebook that they name Emilio, because on the cover it has Emilio Estevez, and I will take a moment here to tell you that there's so much late 80s pop culture in this book that if you're familiar with that time or you were a teen at that time, this is really a pleasure to see all of that popping up. So the pledge that the members of the team take in Emilio requires them to follow any urges that they feel all the way through, no matter what. And to secure this pledge, they each tie this piece of blue fabric around their arms that they can't take off. And their luck turns around and they start winning games. But they also start causing trouble because now they're just letting themselves do whatever they feel like doing. And they pull pranks that begin to escalate. They wreak vengeance on their enemies and they dance naked in the moonlight. And all of this is recorded in Emilio. The dancing naked in the moonlight is their connection to witchcraft. And Danvers, Massachusetts is actually where the Salem witch trials took place. It used to be called Salem Village. And there is a big piece of witchcraft in this book, which is interesting because we are also looking at a group of young women, this field hockey team, who are changing the story and changing their situation, they believe, by the sort of spell that they've cast in this notebook. And also, at the time that the Danvers Falcons' luck is turning around, they are putting on a play in their school, The Crucible, which is about the Salem witch trials. So this is sort of layered in there in a very interesting way. Emilio is not their only master. One of the players, named Jen Fiorenza, and I love the characters' names. They're so memorable. We have Mel Boucher, Becca Bajelica, Little Smitty, Girl Corey, Boy Corey. So Jen Fiorenza has these magnificent 80s bangs. So really just fluffed up over the top. And this poof of hair becomes its own character called the Claw. And the Claw exudes its own power. So the girls also start doing what the Claw tells them to do. If this sounds funny to you, it is very funny. This book is laugh out loud funny. It's hilarious. And the Claw is not the only bodily feature that becomes its own character. There's also the spot, which is a love bite on Mel Boucher's neck that grows, and they call that Le Splotch. It also could be reminiscent of the devil's mark that was said that existed on the people who were accused of being witches back in Salem Village. And later there is a character, the Chin, which belongs to a girl who is writing for the school newspaper and wants to tell the story of the Danvers Falcons. So the story is being told to us in the first person plural. We don't know who's telling it to us, but we're learning about each one of the players on the team. Each chapter is a different game. This style of narration allows us to know everything that's going on. So the narrator appears to be one of the players, but is never addressed by the other players. And each chapter focuses on one of the players in the team. And so eventually these voices start to build as sort of this one voice, this hive mind, that mob mentality becomes reminiscent of the witch hunts and also the group of teenage girls at its center. It is from The Crucible that the title comes. There's a line, "We ride upon sticks," and the way that the play and the location of Danvers is tied into this very, very funny story is just mesmerizing. In an interview in the Paris Review, Quan Barry said, "I've always thought of witchcraft in terms of female empowerment because many of the women who were hung historically did not fit into society in traditional ways. They weren't mothers, or they were old, or they were seen as too powerful." And so that is one of the things that she was trying to convey in creating this field hockey team that uses the power of Emilio to get their way. So as much as the book is about witchcraft, it's also very much about the teenage experience and the steps that seniors, especially in high school, would be taking towards adulthood, and when they have to decide to break away from the group, when they have to decide what they think is right. Quan Barry's third and latest novel, When I'm Gone, Look for Me in the East, came out in 2022. Again, it takes us somewhere very different from historical Vietnam, from Danvers, Massachusetts in the late 80s. This book takes place in Mongolia in about the years 2000 to 2015. There's a line in the book that one of the characters says that I think encapsulates really well the central question of the book, which is, does the story even matter? Or is the witnessing enough? The being aware of each moment of beauty and hardship along the path? And why do we need to believe our lives must add up to some grand narrative? And what happens when we stop believing this? This is really the central question. The book, like her other books, defies summation. It is mesmerizing in the writing. It's lyrical. That poetic voice really shines through. And I almost felt like I experienced this book more than I read it. And I will try to tell you as best I can what I mean by that. The question that came up with the quote I shared with you is the question that's driving really all of the main actions of one of the main characters, Chulun. And Chulun is one of two twins born in Mongolia, where the entire story takes place. And he and his twin are about 20 years old when the story begins. The story is a lot about Buddhism, but the book itself is not about Buddhism, but more about that question, the question of why someone has to believe in something at all. When Chulun and his twin are about 8 years old, they are found by a Buddhist monk, and Chulun's twin, Mun, is recognized as the reincarnation of a deceased lama. And so they are taken to live at this monastery. About a year before this book takes place, Mun has renounced the monastic life. He felt that the temptations of the world were too great, and he was drawn in by them, and he has chosen to live a secular life. Chulun, his twin, has been faithful to the monastic calling, and it's really through Chulun's eyes that we experience the novel. He's our narrator. So in the way that I learned a lot about Vietnamese history from her first book, I learned a lot about Mongolian history, like the true story of Genghis Khan from this book. And I also learned about Mongolia in the time around 2015. You get these history lessons. There are also these long migrations all over the country of Mongolia. Some really riveting survival stories where you're not sure what the outcome's going to be. And then there are these details of life in Mongolia. There are contests that take place on horseback. There are children who hunt with eagles. There's a really interesting Buddhist ritual called a sky burial. And we learn about all these things through this trek that Chulun and his twin Mun, who he has asked to join him, are taking because they have been tasked to find the reincarnation of a great lama. So this spiritual teacher may have been born anywhere in Mongolia. And they go off with this older monk who has an idea of some people that it could be, and they visit each one of those children. And so this takes us all over the country and into these varying situations. So as I said before, though, there are a lot of Buddhist ideas in this book. I don't think you have to be interested in Buddhism to read this book. This book is more about answering those questions of why you believe in what you believe, how you should live your life, what is your place in the world. And you see that these questions are something that can be applied historically and also currently to anyone's life. If it seems like this book is filled with these big ideas that you're contemplating, I would say that's where it was an experience. And I also feel like this book would offer different things to different readers. There's just this quiet beauty to it, that it's also filled with so many stories, which I'd say is true of all three of Quan Barry's novels. And it's kind of astounding how much research has gone into these books and how many characters she's including very well, and how much I felt I got from each of her books. I feel to read the three novels of Quan Barry is to experience really a multitude of worlds. If you choose to dive into any one of these books, prepare to be educated, to also soak in the beautiful language of Quan Barry, this poet who obviously knows the importance of placement and choice of every word. I really hope that you try at least one of these brilliant novels. Thanks for joining me.